When Emil Sinclair begins his story, he tells us there were always two worlds around him. One was bright and safe, the world of his parents, school, and church. In that world, everything was orderly. People were kind, rules were followed, and life felt like a warm home in winter, predictable, clean, and sheltered. He belonged there as the good son, well-mannered and obedient. But even as a child, Sinclair sensed another world pressing in from the edges, a darker one. It showed itself in small ways, the coachman cursing as he passed by, the laughter spilling out of taverns, the beggar crouched at the street corner, the whispers of the maidservants about things children weren't supposed to know. This world was rougher, tempting, dangerous, but strangely alive. Sinclair says, there were two worlds, one of day and light, the other of night and shadow. And he felt the pull of both. One afternoon, wanting to impress some older boys, Sinclair bragged about stealing apples from a farmer's orchard. He didn't really do it. He only told the stories so he wouldn't seem like a sheltered, church-going child. But the lie quickly slipped out of his hands. Franz Cromer, a rough and sly boy from the darker side of town, caught him in it. Cromer dragged him aside, made him repeat the story, and then said he knew the farmer well. If Sinclair didn't pay him money, Cromer would tell. That moment changed everything. Until then, Sinclair's mistakes had been harmless and forgivable. His parents' world always had a way to correct them. But Cromer belonged to the other world, the one without forgiveness. Sinclair couldn't confess to his father, he couldn't undo the lie, and he didn't have the money. So he began to live in secret fear. Cromer whistled for him in the evenings, and like a servant, Sinclair would obey, terrified of exposure. He says, I belonged to Cromer. I was his slave. And it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. Cromer had stepped into Sinclair's bright, safe life like a shadow that couldn't be chased away. The boy who had once felt secure in his parents' house now carried a weight he couldn't share. At the dinner table, while grace was being said, he sat silently, burning with shame, knowing that his family saw him as pure while he was hiding a rotting secret. That was the first time he truly realized the border between the two worlds. Once you cross it, even with something as small as a lie, you can't easily step back. You become marked. The bright world was still around him, but he no longer belonged to it fully. The dark world had claimed him, and Cromer was its cruel messenger. The torment under Cromer's thumb lasted longer than Sinclair could bear. Nights were restless, days felt heavy, and every corner of his safe childhood world seemed poisoned. The boy who once prayed with ease now sat in silence, stiff with guilt, while his parents thought him innocent. Cromer's whistle, sharp and cruel, was enough to send him running in fear. Sinclair lived as if chained, like a little animal caught in a trap. It was around this time that he noticed a new boy at school, Max Demian. He wasn't like the others. Demian was older, strong in presence, but what struck Sinclair most was the way he carried himself. He didn't follow the rules of the schoolyard. He didn't try to fit in, nor did he seem to care about teachers or games. There was something quiet, self-assured, almost ancient about him, as if he knew more than a boy his age should. One day, the class was discussing the biblical story of Cain and Abel. Everyone repeated what they had been taught. Cain was cursed because he murdered his brother. He was marked forever as a criminal. But Demian raised his hand and asked calmly, Are we so sure the story means that? Could it be that Cain wasn't marked as a punishment, but rather as a sign of strength? The room went silent. The teacher grew uncomfortable, almost angry, but Demian didn't flinch. He spoke as though he saw something others couldn't. He explained that perhaps Cain was different, singled out not for guilt, but for greatness, someone who stood apart. The mark, he suggested, wasn't shame. It was power. For Sinclair, this was shocking. He had always taken stories as they were told. Good was good, bad was bad, and the church explained everything. But here was Demian, turning the story upside down, questioning not only morality, but the very authority of how it was taught. The strong are often feared by the weak, Demian said in his steady way, and so stories are told to make strength look like sin. After that, Sinclair couldn't stop thinking about him. Demian seemed to live in that dark world Sinclair had feared, but not as a victim like with Cromer. Instead, he seemed to move through it with ease, even mastery. Where Sinclair felt trapped and guilty, Demian appeared free. One afternoon, Demian approached Sinclair. He had seen the way Cromer treated him. His gaze was calm, almost piercing, as if he could read Sinclair's secret without being told. There was no mockery in him, no cruelty, only a kind of challenge, as if he were saying without words, "You don't have to live like this. You're stronger than you think." For the first time, Sinclair felt a breath of relief, as though a window had opened in his suffocating prison. Demian's presence hinted at a path out of the darkness, not back to the safe, naive world of childhood, but forward into something new, something that required courage. And so, in the shadow of Cain's story, Sinclair's own began to shift. The boy who had been enslaved by fear had met someone who walked unafraid in both worlds. With Demian's shadow now cast across his life, Sinclair began to feel the world around him differently. The suffocating hold of Cromer had faded. Demian had a way of dissolving that fear, but Sinclair was not simply free and innocent again. Something deeper had been stirred in him, a restlessness he couldn't shake. One afternoon, wandering aimlessly, he saw her, a girl walking with poise, carrying herself with a kind of grace that seemed to glow in the air around her. Her name, as he later learned, was Beatrice. Sinclair didn't even speak to her at first, nor did he try to. It wasn't like that. What struck him wasn't the idea of romance, but something almost holy. She became, in his mind, a figure of purity and longing, an image that pulled him out of himself and upwards toward something higher. He began to think of her constantly. He didn't need her presence. Her image alone was enough to transform him. When he drew, he tried to capture her form, her expression, her aura. The sketches weren't perfect, but they filled him with purpose. For the first time since childhood, Sinclair felt an inner fire, not the dull ache of fear, nor the shame of guilt, but the thrill of desire mixed with reverence. Beatrice was not mine. She was not a girl to be touched or won. She was my soul's mirror, the sign of what I was seeking. That's how Sinclair describes her. She was less a person and more a symbol, a living emblem of the path he was meant to walk. Through her he realized that love, beauty, and longing could be spiritual, not just physical. In the glow of this inspiration, Sinclair changed. He paid more attention to how he lived, how he carried himself, how he thought. The boy who once cowered before Cromer now walked with a certain quiet dignity. He painted, he read, he reflected. He was still young, still searching, but Beatrice had awakened something, the awareness that life contained more than rules and fear. It contained meaning. Yet Beatrice remained distant. He never truly knew her, never held a conversation of depth, and still her presence was enough. She was like a guiding star, unreachable but real, pulling him forward. And as Sinclair watched himself slowly transform under her influence, he began to sense that this search, this hunger for beauty and truth, wasn't about Beatrice alone. She was a symbol of something greater, something that, sooner or later, he would have to seek inside himself. Beatrice had awakened something inside Sinclair, a sense of yearning that lifted him above the gray routine of school and family. But with this awakening came a sharper sense of conflict. He could no longer be fully at home in the safe, bright world of his parents, yet he didn't quite belong in the darker world either. He was in between, unsettled, searching. It was during this restless time that Sinclair began to draw more obsessively. One day, almost without planning, he sketched the face of Beatrice. But when he looked at the finished drawing, something strange stared back at him. The features were hers, yes, but not entirely. There was a firmness, a strange calm, even a familiarity, and then it struck him. It resembled Demian. This realization unsettled him deeply. The two figures, Beatrice, the symbol of beauty and longing, and Demian, the mysterious force who had freed him from Cromer, had merged. He realized that what he sought in them wasn't outside, in other people, but inside himself. They were mirrors, showing him fragments of who he might become. Soon after, Sinclair received a message from Demian, cryptic, powerful. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who would be born must destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas. The words struck Sinclair like thunder. He couldn't entirely grasp them, but he felt their truth vibrating in him. The egg was his safe childhood world, the world of parents, teachers, and rules. To be born into his true self, he had to break it, shatter it, even if it meant leaving behind the comfort of belonging. And Abraxas, this was no simple god of church sermons. Abraxas was something more dangerous, more complete. A god that held both light and darkness, creation and destruction, holiness and sin. A god beyond the childish division of good versus evil. Sinclair realized then that his path wasn't about returning to innocence or staying within the boundaries of the bright world. It was about breaking through, even if it hurt, even if it meant loneliness, even if it meant being misunderstood. The bird within him had begun to stir, pressing its beak against the shell. The world as he had known it, orderly, protective, one-sided, was no longer enough. To live fully, he would have to destroy it. After the words about the bird and the egg, Sinclair was no longer the same. Something in him had cracked open. The safe patterns of school and home. The endless repetition of duties and prayers. None of it felt solid anymore. He couldn't unsee what he had glimpsed, that he was meant to grow into something different, something beyond what his parents or teachers expected. He began to live more inside himself. At school, while others repeated lessons or played their games, Sinclair's thoughts drifted elsewhere. He carried Demian's words like a secret fire in his chest. The teachers scolded him for distraction, but he felt the scolding only confirmed what he already knew, that their world wasn't his anymore. At home, too, he grew distant. His parents loved him, but he felt their love was tied to the boy he used to be, the obedient child of light. They couldn't see, nor could they accept, the new stirrings in him, the doubts, the questions, the need to step beyond their circle of safety. He still sat at their table, bowed his head for grace, answered politely. But inside, he was elsewhere, listening to a different voice. Loneliness set in. He felt himself walking a narrow path that few others even noticed. But there was also a strange sweetness in that loneliness. He wasn't a child anymore, and though he felt cut off, he also felt stronger, as if this solitude was the price of becoming himself. He noticed how people around him lived without questioning, satisfied with what they were told was right and wrong. But Sinclair couldn't accept that anymore. He saw that the world wasn't divided into neat halves of good and evil, but woven together, darkness and light in one fabric. And he began to feel a quiet pride that he could see what others couldn't. Sometimes, though, he longed for Demian. The cryptic guidance, the way his words had the weight of truth, Sinclair wished he could speak to him again, to have that presence near him. Still, the seed had been planted. The boy who once feared Cromer, who once lived under guilt, was gone. In his place was someone new, uncertain, yes, but also awake, beginning to carve a path toward a life not dictated by others, but by the call within. The bird had cracked the shell, and Sinclair had begun to breathe the air of a larger world. By now Sinclair lived in a state of in-between, no longer the obedient child of the bright world, not yet fully someone new. He carried the secret words about Abraxas like a hidden flame, but he longed for guidance, for someone who could help him understand what these visions meant. That's when he met Pistorius. On the surface, Pistorius was just an organist, a music teacher, a man a little older, a little eccentric. But to Sinclair he quickly became much more. Their conversations wandered far beyond ordinary lessons. Pistorius spoke of myths, of symbols, of gods forgotten by the church. In his dimly lit room, filled with the scent of old books and the sound of music, Pistorius told Sinclair that humanity once worshipped not only the god of goodness and light, but also the forces of darkness and destruction. He explained that the figure of Abraxas united both, the holy and the damned, creation and ruin, in one whole. "Our God is too simple," Pistorius would say. "He is only half." True divinity embraces both the devil and the angel, both the bright and the dark. These words resonated deeply with Sinclair. He had felt, since childhood, that the world wasn't as neatly divided as everyone claimed. Now here was someone confirming it, even celebrating it. Often Pistorius would play music for him, letting the organ fill the room with heavy, swelling tones. For Sinclair, the sound carried him into that mysterious space between worlds, where opposites touched and dissolved. They spoke about dreams. Sinclair confessed the strange images that haunted him, birds breaking from eggs, faces that blurred into one another, longing for something unnamed. Pistorius listened with the patience of a guide. He told him not to dismiss these dreams, but to honor them, to see them as messages from the deeper self, from the hidden layers of the soul. But Pistorius was not a flawless prophet. There were moments when Sinclair sensed in him a kind of weariness, a fear of going too far. Pistorius himself admitted he was only a fellow traveler, still caught by certain limits. And that was important, for Sinclair began to see that even mentors could not carry him all the way. They could open doors, but he would have to walk through alone. Still, this friendship was a revelation. For the first time, Sinclair had language for the strange forces inside him. Abraxas was no longer a mystery, but a symbol he could grasp, the god of wholeness, of contradiction, of life as it truly is.
Leaving Pistorius's company, Sinclair often felt lighter, stronger, as though his scattered yearnings had been given a shape. Yet beneath it all remained the knowledge that this was only the beginning. A god like Abraxas did not simply comfort, it demanded transformation. Emil Sinclair. By this point, Sinclair has passed through storms of confusion, loneliness, and awakening, and now we see him step into something that feels almost mystical. His meeting with Frau Eva, Damian's mother. When Sinclair first enters her presence, it is as if he has found the figure he has been unconsciously seeking all along. Hesse doesn't describe her like an ordinary woman. No, she feels more like a revelation. She carries a presence that seems eternal, both motherly and yet beyond mother, both woman and something more than woman. Sinclair feels immediately that she is the embodiment of the image he has carried in his soul since childhood, the archetypal figure of love, wisdom, and destiny. Her beauty is not about youth or perfection of form. It is something deeper. She radiates an energy, a serenity that makes Sinclair feel at once a child and a man. And unlike anyone else before, she looks at him in a way that sees him fully, his struggles, his hidden truths, his unspoken desires. In her gaze, Sinclair feels understood without having to explain himself. Their conversations are gentle but profound. Eva listens, but she also teaches without lecturing. She speaks of inner strength, of the importance of becoming whole, of following one's own path no matter how lonely or difficult. And as she speaks, Sinclair feels that she is not simply giving him advice. She is awakening something that was already there inside him, something he had longed for, but could not yet name. There is also an undeniable intimacy here, almost a sacred eroticism. Sinclair feels love for her, but it is not mere romantic love, nor only maternal affection. It is both. It is everything at once. Eva seems to carry within her the reconciliation of opposites, the light and the dark, the masculine and the feminine, the sacred and the sensual. In her, Sinclair perceives the unity of life itself. Being near her feels like standing before the deepest mystery of existence. And for Sinclair, it is the final step in his journey of self-discovery. With Eva, he no longer feels the need to cling to one world or the other. He begins to understand what Demian and all his lessons have been pointing toward. That true growth comes when we embrace the totality of who we are, the union of opposites within us. By the end of the chapter, Sinclair feels reborn. He has not simply met a person. He has encountered an archetype, a living symbol of his destiny. In Eva, he finds the guide who will allow him to walk into the future without fear. War arrives. It does not come suddenly, but like a gathering storm, whispered at first, then rumbling louder,
until the whole world is caught in its grip. For Sinclair, the news of war is not just political. It feels inevitable, almost as though everything he has lived through, every symbol, every dream, has been leading him here. The world itself seems to be shattering, much like the egg in his vision long ago. The shell of the old order cracking so that something new may be born. He is a soldier now, swallowed into the machinery of conflict, surrounded by thousands of young men like himself, each caught in the tide of history. The atmosphere is heavy, yet inside Sinclair there is a strange calmness. The teachings of Demian, the presence of Eva, all of it has prepared him for this. He senses that this war is not only about nations fighting. It is the outer reflection of an inner battle, the clash of two worlds, the collapse of one age and the birth of another. In the chaos of the front lines, Sinclair and Demian find each other once more. Their bond, unspoken but unbreakable, is stronger than ever. Demian, however, carries an air of inevitability around him, as though he has known all along that this was where their paths would converge. And then the moment comes. Sinclair is wounded, drifting between life and death, in pain yet strangely lucid. He finds himself again in that borderland between two worlds. Demian is beside him, leaning close, speaking words that cut through the haze. If you ever need me, if you ever find yourself alone and in despair, call me. You'll find me inside you, Sinclair. You always will. It is not just comfort, it is a passing of the torch. Demian is telling him that he too carries the strength, the knowledge, the vision. He no longer needs Demian as an external guide, for Demian has become part of him, inseparable from his own soul. And then Sinclair drifts into unconsciousness. The chapter ends not with resolution, but with an opening. The war rages on, the world is burning, but within Sinclair there is a seed of transformation. He has been prepared to step into a new age, to live with the unity of opposites, with the wisdom that light and shadow belong to one whole. The novel closes on this ambiguous note, suspended between despair and hope, destruction and rebirth. Like the egg of the world breaking apart, it suggests that something vast, unknown, and inevitable is about to emerge, not only for Sinclair, but for humanity itself.